start with a few questions, and then we're going to show you something else as well. You were talking about how, in the introduction, about how the films resonate with themes that you've been working through in your books, and it seems to me that there's an even more direct. You talked about anthropology, and the protagonist of Staten Island is a corporate anthropologist. It seems to me that there's an even more direct connection between Dial History and Remainder, or at least a more obvious connection.
Yeah, I mean, Remainder ends with an airline hijack,
and it starts with something.
Falling from the sky, and I guess the figure of the terrorist is kind of hovering on the margins of that book. But I guess terror is, and I think it's the same in Johann's film. I mean, I haven't seen this film in a all the way through in quite a few years, and it's incredibly powerful and very shocking and incredibly moving as well. And I think ultimately, I mean, terror in it is it's just like an almost theological condition. It's not. It's kind of beyond this direct political order. It's just like it's the condition of our. It's like for Rilke. There are every angel is terrifying, right? I mean, we live in this relation to death within this plot, and with the endless, relentless kind of terror of media, and I think this is what this film captures so brilliantly and so powerfully, and I guess in a way I was kind of trying to get to a similar place with Remainder. I mean, I can't remember when I first saw this film. I think it was around the time I was finishing the book, either just before or just after.
You had to write just a little paragraph about these films when we announced this, and there was a line in it, and I was hoping you could maybe expand on that, where you said that all art either incubates or keeps at bay, or both, a type of violence.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very violent film, and it's and Johann uses this technique that I guess people like Kenneth Anger pioneered, of just the kind of overlaying easy listening music over scenes of horrific kind of horror, which has its own kind of introduces its own kind of weird disconnect, and yeah, the violence of I mean, I think DeLillo's passage is really, really good, about this kind of the novelist's desire to produce some kind of event.
Do you agree with that? I mean, you hear that through the film several times, the idea of the novelists and the terrorists playing a zero-sum game. And
I mean, it seems, I think DeLillo's right, but it seems that, even that seems a bit quaint in a way. I think we've kind of gone beyond. I mean, neither the novelist nor the terrorist have actually won this zero-sum game. Media has. They're all, the sequence with the Japanese girl just being thrust out of the belly of a plane and put in front of all these cameras and all this weeping going on around her. I mean, it seems so kind of powerful. This is like this. I guess this is kind of Johann's manifesto about what it is to kind of be alive, in a way. And so I'm rambling a bit.
I thought maybe we could talk a bit more about why, in what ways you think these two films resonate with the new book. You mentioned the Situationists in your introduction. Staten Island, I assume SI as a.
Yeah, there's a kind of play there, I guess. I mean, so at one point the hero of, or whatever, anti-hero, the narrator of Staten Island is a corporate anthropologist. More than 50% of anthropology graduates now work for corporations, and this is what he does. And in his kind of darker moments, he harbours these fantasies of kind of turning a la Burroughs and kind of deploying the tools of anthropology to bring the whole system crashing down. And but this is, of course, in a way, a kind of adolescent fantasy. He realises that I was reading this book by Mackenzie Walk, a hacker's manifesto, where he says, it's not terrorists that that cause nuclear power plants to blow up, and it's not anarchists or hackers that cause stock market systems to crash. They do that on their own. so in a way, the catastrophe is already written into the script. It doesn't need a heroic agent to come in and kind of make it happen. So this sense of complete, there are these writing systems that are kind of happening already, independent of the writer or any other type of kind of activist. I think this is a kind of interesting situation, because then how do you navigate that? How do you retain any idea of what writing might be without kind of escaping into naive fantasies of whatever, this or that, authenticity, which the terrorism is the most guilty of course. The terrorist is like a bad novelist in that respect. They totally believe in authenticity and self-mastery and a certain form of kind of tragic authenticity, which is the hallmark of bad writing.
It was interesting to hear you talk about these two films in relation to anthropology. You talked about the relationship between the novelist and the terrorist. What about the novelist and the anthropologist?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing this book, I was reading lots of Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the great mid-century French anthropologist. And two things about him really stand out. One is that he's a better writer than any of his contemporary proper French writers. I mean, whichever way you want to count it, level of prose or insight or everything. I mean, he's brilliant. And the other thing is this kind of melancholy longing to be a great writer. But at the same time, he's almost thought himself into a position where this is no longer possible, in the same way as DeLillo's character does there. And there's a wonderful scene kind of halfway through Tristes Tropiques, his signature work, where he's stuck in some jungle and there's not going to be a boat out for another 3 months, and he's smoked all his cigarettes and drunk all his wine, and he's just like really bored, and he's got all these research notes, and he just kind of goes, oh, screw this, I'm going to become a great writer like Racine or Corneille, and he starts writing an epic drama. He turns his notes over, and he writes on the back of these notes some epic drama for 6 days, and like God, on the 7th day he gives up, he stops, and I kind of like to imagine him, or in fact I like to imagine the paper, right, the actual paper that he writes on. So on one side you have kind of evidence-based empirical research, reportage, documents. On the other side you've got epic art, and if you could kind of put it under a microscope and blow that up to magnify it 1,000 times, you'd have just this pulpy no man's land of neither nor, that kind of fails to be one, fails to be the other, and that, I think that would kind of be the space of literature, maybe, this unresolved, not quite right neutral zone, so yeah.
So besides reading Lévi-Strauss, were you also, I'm wondering, did you do research about contemporary, this sort of corporate entrepreneur?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Do you identify with that in some way? Because I think this narrator of the book is somebody who, I think he talks about it in terms of feeding theory into the machine.
Yeah, I mean, I have a cousin that does exactly this. It's, he got a double first in philosophy and literature, and he's feeding left-wing, left-field theory, Adorno, Deleuze, Badiou, back into clothing manufacturers and government think tanks. I mean, he doesn't say it's Badiou or Deleuze, but basically it is. I mean, the big retail companies don't want to hear about such characters, but it's a kind of very interesting kind of feedback loop. And at the same time, he says it's really intellectually stimulating. With universities just kind of becoming businesses in the UK, this has happened kind of overnight. Cutting-edge consultancies, architecture firm designers have become, kind of creatively more funky kind of spaces to be in. So this is, I mean, I guess my anthropologist guy is a blatant stand-in for a writer. I mean, he is a writer, he writes, or he fails to write. And so I was kind of using this to think through a set of, problems about, yeah, writing, who writes, you know, we're surrounded by, I was reading lots of Michel de Certeau, this anthropologist, who talks about scriptural systems. You know, we exist within scriptural systems, and society is he gets this from Kafka, you know, this idea of a giant writing machine inside which we're strapped. And this is, you know, which kind of raises the question, well, what's the writer for then? You know? And could we imagine a kind of counter-scriptural writing, a kind of errant, wandering grapheme, you know, that would somehow not exist outside this, because there is no outside, but somehow, you know, operate slightly differently.
Were you thinking of at all about any films when you were writing Satin Island?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, that whole tradition that Johann's film is coming out of, you know, figures like Chris Marker, where anthropology and documentary making and art kind of come together so brilliantly, and you know, people like who's the guy that made Les Maîtres Fous? Is it Jean Rouch? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so a whole bunch of that type of work, and Rob Greer, like Alan René, you know, his kind of quasi-documentaries as well. So yeah, and Burroughs. I mean, lots of the kind of, you know, those fantasies that. I was being a bit generous. It is incoherent, that film, but in a kind of it is incoherent. But there's a real, you know, there is a real cogency to Burroughs's thinking along these lines that the film is kind of part of, and I think he's kind of onto something. I think he's a significant media theorist ultimately. I think he's a very important one.
So is that typical of your process to really draw on cinema when you're writing? I mean, I think in Remainder, I think it's it's Mean Streets, right, that sort of triggers his obsession with.
He imagines De Niro is perfectly authentic, which is completely wrong. But this, but he gets kind of obsessed with just the smoothness of being in a movie. What if you could be in a movie without it being a movie? Then you'd just be somehow. You know, there would be no gap of not being in a movie. You'd be the kind of the hero of the plot without even knowing there's a plot. But so this is what the hero kind of thinks. But at the same when I was writing it, I was watching lots of. I kept thinking about Warhol and, you know, slowness and repetition and trauma and creation, and as I'm sure Johann was when he made this film. But also Tarkovsky and just the incredible slowness and the way the camera just moves over a wall for 7 minutes, and for the first 2 minutes it's incredibly boring, and then after about 4 minutes you're just hypnotized that you're noticing every mark in the wall, or when, you know, when someone's shot in Andrei Rublev, he instantly moves the camera away from the dying person onto the patterns of the blood, and this becomes a kind of you know, this kind of almost amoral provocation.
Were there films for Sea and Men in Space? I think I know the answer for Sea. You've written about this, right? Cocteau and...
Oh, sure. I mean, yeah, that whole film came out of a long-standing obsession I've had with Cocteau's Orphée, his take on the Orpheus myth, which all revolves around the radio. And this kind of feedback loop that's been a dead poet transmitting in code over the radio, which Cocteau got the idea of from the Resistance and the BBC during World War II. They were kind of transmitting in poem code, and so again, it all comes back to media. I mean, I think it's about, you know, this space of mediation and encryption and you know, death-driven plots, as Delillo says, which becomes these kind of sites of incredible kind of haunting. You know, the media becomes this crypt in which history is somehow leaking out in these haunting ways. And I think this is what this film is just so powerful. I'm speechless.
Well,
should we do a surprise?
Yeah, I think we should do it. We should. We have a little 3-minute film to show, and then we're going to bring someone up.
Great. Should I say something about?